In 1976, a 15-year-old girl had been found dead.
Noah Jones had confessed to the crime and pleaded guilty to it. He'd made an elaborate, complete confession.
4 decades after the initial conviction, the case was reopened, and a startling discovery was made.
Back then in 1976, there was no DNA technology.
The police were always convinced that somebody else was involved. They managed to extract a full DNA profile from Janet's clothing.
Investigators searched for the truth. Would they finally find it?
He knew the area like the back of his hand. He was big and broad for his age. He was a bit of a brute.
He lived with his parents no more than about 400 yards from Janet Cummins' home address.
He folded his arms, he was very defensive.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummins in January 1976?
I'm Dermot Murnaghan, and this is Killer Britain. Flint is a town and community in Flintshire in North Wales, lying on the estuary of the River Dee.
It's a very close-knit community. Everybody here knows each other. Everybody has lived here for years. Around about the 70s, it was grown out of the Industrial Revolution, so people not only lived here, but worked here in the factories and mills surrounding the town.
Quite an affluent town. People would know each other and know each other's business.
Yes, there will be crime, but quite low level. There was a high employment rate, and generally, people in Flint felt safe.
This is Janet Cummins, born on the 9th of June 1960. She was raised in Flint by her mother Eileen and her father Edward. Kelly Williams, senior reporter for the North Wales Daily Post. She knows the Flint community and its people well.
Janet was an innocent, genuine, friendly girl. She was bubbly, but she used to still play with dolls at 15, so she still had that innocence and vulnerability about her.
She lived with her parents on a small housing estate in the middle of Flint town.
Eileen was a nurse most of her life, and Edward Ted worked in the local steelworks all of his life, having served in the army previously, sort of thing. You know, doted upon their daughter. She was the centre of their life, didn't have any other children. Eileen describes Janet as still a little girl, even though she was 15.
Janet's extended family lived in the same neighbourhood.
She lived next door to her cousins, so they would often go on holiday together. They were brought up together, so they were a very close family and they got on really well. It's a very common thing that families would live in the same street or nearby, in this community particularly.
Late in 1975, the new leisure centre opened in Flint town centre, and Janet and her friends would spend an awful lot of time there, going to the swimming pool, and would mix with friends at that location.
On Wednesday, the 7th of January, 1976, Janet Cummins asked her mother if she could go out that evening.
It was the 7th of January. Janet came home from school, as she normally did, about 3:30. Asked her mother whether she could go out to the swimming pool that evening. She had a slight cold, and her mother really didn't want her to go, so Janet retired to her bedroom.
Janet agreed that she would go swimming the following day. She ate dinner in her room.
When Mum went to check on her about 7:30, she'd seen that Janet had actually left the house.
She left a note for her mum saying that she would be back at 8:30. She wanted to go swimming to the local bath with her friend, which is what she did.
She was 15, playing outside in the street, as kids did in the 70s, you know, playing with her friends out in the street. You know, no fears about her walking down to the swimming bath.
January the 7th was cold and wet. Janet walked to the swimming pool to meet her friends. A few miles away, another group of teenagers were planning their night.
Members of the travelling fraternity that had set up an illegal encampment about 3 miles away from Flint in a small village called Northup.
18-year-old Noel Jones was a part of that travellers' community. He was planning to spend time with his girlfriend that evening. 15-year-old Janet met with friends at the swimming baths.
We know that she did actually go to the baths. After she'd been for her swim, she told her friend that she was going to go straight home. They'd had a nice time.
Janet's friends would later tell police that the time was approximately 7:30 p.m. when Janet left, the same time that her mother had gone to check on her. Janet walked down the alleyway that linked these swimming baths with the estate where she lived.
She'd taken the normal route that she would use to walk to her home address. So from the swimming pool to her house, it would have taken perhaps 10 minutes, quarter of an hour.
A boy had seen her talking to 2 other boys, laughing and joking. She'd obviously intended to be back home by 8:30, and there was nothing to suggest that wouldn't happen.
Witnesses would later confirm that it was 8:10 p.m. when Janet was seen chatting to the 2 other boys. One was described as thin and fair-haired, the other older-looking, stockily built. At 8:30 p.m, Janet had not returned home. Her parents were becoming concerned.
They became quite worried. I went to visit several of her friends at their houses. They were by now home, but said that they'd last seen Janet leave the leisure centre at 7:30 that evening.
Her parents continued to search and speak to her circle of friends. As it got later, temperatures dropped below 0 degrees centigrade.
It got to around 11 o'clock, and her mum went to the police station to report her missing while her father and uncle went out looking for her.
By 12 o'clock, at 12 p.m, you can imagine that her parents were very worried indeed, and in fact frantic.
It was nothing like she'd ever done before, so major alarm bells were ringing.
As family, police and neighbours frantically searched, Flint held its breath. Where was 15-year-old Janet Commins, and who were the 2 boys that witnesses had seen her speaking with? By the morning of the 8th of January, 15-year-old Janet Commins, a schoolgirl from Flint in Wales, was still missing.
In the police's mind at the time, it was just a teenage girl who'd sneaked out the house to go and see her friends, and she'd probably be pushing her luck to come back as late as she could.
The policing has changed, but a missing person report was filled in. Obviously, the police didn't think for 1 minute back then she would have come to any harm. Thought perhaps she might have had a secret boyfriend.
Police attempted to reassure Janet's parents, but Ted and Eileen knew there was no boyfriend. Detective Superintendent Steve Lloyd would one day be tasked with analysing Janet's life.
She still played in the street, she played with dolls, she was quite family-orientated with the cousins. And the fact that everybody we spoke to, really, from the 76 investigation, friends and associates of Janet, there was no mention of a boyfriend.
As hours and days passed and Janet had still not been located, the police and community became increasingly concerned.
There were police on every corner. They were combing the fields. They were on their hands and knees, picking through the grass, looking for clues, looking for a trace of her. In Flint, it would have had a massive effect on the area of a child being reported missing. Everybody knows each other. Everybody's looking out for each other here.
Hundreds of neighbours volunteered to help in the search for Janet. Children were stopped from playing in the street by anxious parents. Men in the immediate vicinity of Janet's house were interviewed. 4 days after Janet's disappearance, 2 children were playing hide-and-seek in a school playing field near Gwynedd Primary School. They were near to Janet's route home from the swimming baths.
We're now into the 11th of January. Some children found what they thought initially was a doll or a dummy hidden in some undergrowth on the playing fields.
Unsure of what they'd seen, the children called for help.
They reported the matter. The school caretaker attended, took a closer look, and found that it was the body of a young female child. Obviously, they would have considered that that's highly probable to be the body of Janet Cummins.
Janet Cummins' body was discovered in a thicket on the school field, 450 yards from her home. Her shoes were found nearby. Even experienced police officers were distressed by the news.
I think any police officer will tell you the investigation, the death or the murder of a child is probably one of the most difficult experiences they can do. It's usually emotive, obviously, because you're investigating the death of innocence, aren't you, really?
Flint had never seen a murder up until Janet Cummins' death, so nobody would have been thinking that anything like that would have happened.
Janet had been smothered, strangled, so we had no evidence that of a weapon, such as a knife or a gun.
Dr. Brian Rogers, consultant pathologist to the Home Office, was later asked to review the pathology report of Janet's violent death.
She was the victim of quite a violent sexual assault, and she had marks on her, the presence of asphyxial, what we call petechial hemorrhages, these pinpoint hemorrhages that you see on the face, in asphyxia and in the conjunctival lining of the eyelids.
Mud found on Janet's clothing suggested that part of the attack occurred at the town's Gortheth Circle, a stone circle that stands as a lasting reminder of the National Eisteddfod, a Welsh cultural and music festival which was held in Flint in 1969.
The body initially, we think, was left in some undergrowth, but then it was dragged for about 100 yards where she was hidden in a wooden copse.
There were scratch marks to the neck, which could have been caused by fingernails.
For Janet's parents, it was devastating news.
Flint had never seen anything like it. There were officers everywhere. There was a tent put up. There was forensic scientists, plenty of people on the scene just combing for evidence. It would have been something that Flint would never have experienced before.
Police began an investigation into the death of Janet Cummins.
It was felt back then that it was Janet's body and her clothing was the area likely to get the best forensic results.
Preserving the scene, investigators discovered Janet had died whilst being forced onto her front. Judging from the mud on her clothes, the attack had happened on her walk home. Officers had an idea of how she'd been killed and where, but not precisely when.
We know that it is extremely difficult to come to an accurate time of death, and quite often we can only give an estimation. If you're trying to exclude a suspect based on purely a time of death, then I think you can be on dangerous ground.
Police sealed samples of her clothing for forensic tests and got their first major breakthrough.
Back then in 1976, there was no DNA technology. What could you do with swabs? Well, you can actually analyse those swabs to see if you get a blood grouping from what was identified to be semen.
Janet had blood type B. The killer's blood group was type O. The police interviewed as many people as possible about their movements. They had also responded to tip-offs about 18-year-old Noel Jones, a young man from the traveller community.
After Janet's body was discovered, all local men aged between 17 and 22 were brought in for questioning. Locals had reported that they'd seen some people on the outskirts of town in a lay-by. That was Noel Jones and an accomplice of his.
When questioned by police at the traveller's site, Noel Jones initially offered a plausible account of his actions that night.
He was a creature of habit. He was able to tell police that he would definitely have been in a pub in Buckley called back then The Trap, and that's where he was because he went there every night. He had a young 15-year-old girlfriend called Linda, And he said, I was with Linda till at least about 10:30 on that evening, as I am every night.
After an argument with Noel Jones, his girlfriend made a statement to the police.
She reported that he'd said to him that he'd kill her like he killed that girl.
Having told police, detectives compared Jones's blood sample to the blood evidence found on Janet's body.
When that was analysed, it was the same blood group type as Noel Jones.
Noel Jones was arrested.
It's the death of a child. The investigating officers would have been under extreme pressure from the very senior officers to get the matter detected as soon as possible.
18-year-old Noel Jones was a member of the traveller community, illiterate, unable to read or write.
Noel Jones didn't finish schooling and, nowadays would be classed as a vulnerable person.
The position he was in, he was under a great deal of pressure for a young, vulnerable man, and he was vulnerable.
He was just like a rabbit in the headlights. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't have access to a solicitor who could advise him on what to say and what not to say. He just didn't really know what to do. Suddenly he just found himself caught up in this whirlwind.
Police in North Wales believed that Noel had not been acting alone. On the night of her death, Janet Commins had been seen talking to two boys. A friend of Noel's was charged in connection with the offence, but there was no evidence to support a conviction. Noel Jones told police he'd been joking when he told his girlfriend that he'd killed Janet.
He initially denied anything to do with it. After the preliminary interview, two detectives from the Regional Crime Squad took over the interview.
Specialised units to deal with high-level crime, regional crime squads, were a fixture of British policing in the 1970s.
What you did find is that they tended to have a lot more experience than North Wales Police in, for example, interviewing murder suspects, because, homicides happen regularly. They were quite regularly called upon to deal with homicide investigations, so they did have that experience.
Under questioning by a regional crime squad, Noel Jones confessed.
He was interviewed on 3 separate occasions, and by the end of it, he'd signed a confession to a crime. Noel and his associate, his friend, were both charged with murder. The case against his friend was dropped very quickly following a review of the case by lawyers. He said, there's no evidence at all.
Noel Jones was taken out in the police car on the second night, I think, and they drove round Flint, where he's pointing out where he saw Janet first of all, and where he followed it over the fields of Flint High School, almost past Janet's home address, and to the Gorset Stones where they've attacked her.
Noel Jones was remanded in custody and a court date set for the summer of 1976. As the court date got closer, Noel Jones's version of events changed.
He told his lawyer he wasn't responsible. He told his probation worker that he wasn't responsible, and was denying everything to his family as well, and saying, I haven't done this.
Noel wanted to retract his confession. He claimed to be an innocent man. As his trial began, barristers from both sides of the case approached the judge.
The two barristers in the case stopped the proceedings and approached the judge and asked if it would be okay to consider a lesser plea bargain, in that he would plead guilty to manslaughter.
New evidence found on Janet's body meant a charge of manslaughter was plausible.
Pathology said she wasn't actually strangled. There were actually very few injuries to the body of Janet. And what they felt is that whilst she was being sexually assaulted, whilst she was being raped, she was being smothered as well, and the body just passed away. the heart stopped as a result of the shock of what was happening.
The judge agreed that a charge of manslaughter, not violent death, against Noel Jones would be appropriate. His then barristers advised Noel Jones to plead guilty to manslaughter.
If he'd been convicted of murder, would probably have served in the region of 20 to 25 years in prison.
Noel Jones, who at this point was already in too deep, had obviously seen the opportunity to take the lesser of the two evils, had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
The plea bargain would have ramifications. As far as the law was concerned, Janet had not been murdered. She had died as a result of an illegal act, manslaughter.
He spent 6 years in prison in Liverpool, had a torrid time. He was, as far as the authorities and fellow inmates were concerned, the killer of a young girl. He was regularly beaten, had no sort of friends or associates there, so spent a lot of time alone in his cell for 6 years.
18-year-old Noel Jones was serving his prison sentence. The suspected accomplice remained unknown.
It was believed that there was another accomplice, and that was the reason why the investigation was reopened, to see if any charges could be brought against that potential other accomplice.
The case file concerning the killing of Janet Commins remained open, with the potential to identify and prosecute a second attacker still a possibility. Among those originally interviewed in connection with the death of Janet Commins was Stephen Hough. At the time of Janet's death in 1976, he was 16.
Stephen Hough was born and bred in Flint. He knew the area like the back of his hand. When he was a teenager, he was really athletic. He was big and broad for his age. He was 13.5 stone by the time he was 16. He was a bit of a brute, not a very nice person.
It was quite intimidating to other pupils. Having left school, he was a member of the ice hockey team in nearby Queen's Ferry, played for the senior side as a 16, 17-year-old, and also played sort of rugby for Flint Rugby Club as well.
Stephen Hough lived just around the corner from the Commins family.
He lived with his parents no more than about 400 yards from Janet Commins' home address.
Janet Commins and Stephen Hough had attended the same school, separated by a school year. Stephen Hough left school in 1975.
What we learned from Stephen Hough is that on the day that Janet went missing, he was a 16-year-old boy, 5 days short of his 17th birthday.
Could Hough have been one of the boys seen by a witness talking to Janet at around 8:10 on the night she disappeared? His build matched the description given by the witness.
When he was asked general questions about where he was on the date that Janet was missing, he was particularly nervous and couldn't really answer their questions.
Hough was able to provide an alibi.
The alibi he gave on the night that he was near the leisure centre in Flint in his car, masturbating, looking at pornographic magazines, which seems a bizarre alibi to give, doesn't it?
Stephen Hough initially told police officers that he had been masturbating in his car at the time because his house was quite crowded and he didn't have any privacy. But then he changed his story to say that, in fact, he had been siphoning petrol illegally.
Hough confessed to the crime of siphoning petrol, a crime for which he was later charged and given a fine for. In 1981, Stephen Hough left Flint and joined the army.
He stayed in Flint for a few years, but then joined the army. Initially served in the United Kingdom, where we learnt of an attack he carried out.
Whilst in the army, Stephen Hough married and had children. His military work sent him to Germany.
There was one episode in Germany when he was serving in the army that led him to a jail sentence for violence.
Stephen Hough had been out drinking for most of the day. This waitress walked into the female toilet, closely followed by Stephen Hough. He attacked that female and he strangled her to the point that she passed out. Witnesses were able to say that he was clearly British because he still had his uniform on. Inquiries led them to Stephen Hough.
He had sexually assaulted a woman in a toilet block and was sentenced to 5 years in a military prison.
It was the 1980s, too early for DNA samples to be taken from prisoners. In 1993, after serving his sentence and being discharged from the army, Stephen Hough returned to his hometown of Flint in search of employment.
Hough was a local man who'd been schooled in Flint, been brought up in Flint, married in Flint.
He came back to this country and really led, effectively, a crime-free existence as far as we know.
Stephen Hough returned to life in Flint. Noel Jones had been released from prison years earlier in 1982. He served half of the 12-year sentence.
When he came out, although he was able to rebuild his life, it had a major impact on him.
It was only in 1982 when he was released that he was able to rebuild his life. He changed his name so that he'd be anonymised, went on to marry, had some children, and it was only his family that he ever told about what happened to him.
Despite Noel Jones's conviction, the police still had on file the suspicion of a second offender.
So it was early 2000s that police decided to reopen the cold case files into Janet's death, but actually it took them 3 years to find the files. But when they did find them, they managed to extract a full DNA profile from Janet's clothing.
By 2003, forensic scientists had the ability to identify genetic codes in DNA samples in a way that was not possible 30 years earlier when Janet died. In 1976, police had only been able to ascertain blood groups.
In those days, when that was analysed, it was the same blood group type as Noel Jones, but then so are thousands and thousands of people in the country. Now we have DNA, which is obviously a much more accurate tool.
The DNA found was not a match to Noel Jones. This was deemed to be further evidence of a second assailant.
We decided to upload it onto the national database to see if, at any time in the future, that would actually hit against a person that may be of interest to that inquiry.
The UK National DNA Database consists of millions of DNA samples from hundreds of thousands of crime scenes. It is the longest running and largest forensic DNA database in the entire world. But there was no match for the DNA recovered from the Janet Commins crime scene found on the National DNA Database. By 2016, Stephen Hough had separated from his first wife after 8 years of marriage. He'd remarried, but also separated from his second wife.
But, you know, in 2016, he carried out another sexual assault.
He had a family of his own, but in 2016, he had been arrested for a sexual assault on a 15-year-old.
Stephen Hough was accused of the sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl. Police took a DNA sample.
When Stephen Hough was arrested for a sexual assault, his DNA was run through the database.
That was the sample that was compared with the existing samples on the retention by the police.
Stephen Hough was released pending the results. Police found a match to the DNA sample taken from Janet Commins.
Intimate swabs clearly showed that he'd had intimate contact with Janet Commins around the time of her death. There was nothing else, no other profile.
The The new DNA evidence not only revealed that Hough had been involved in Janet's death, but suggested nobody else was.
Forensically, there's nothing whatsoever to indicate that anyone else was involved in Janet's killing. So when we got those results, I had to make a decision, and we made the decision to arrest Stephen Hough in September of 2016. He was arrested in the cab of a lorry. By now, he was a long-distance lorry driver, and we arrested him in his cab in the docks of a port in the south of England.
Stephen Hough did not seem surprised by the arrest.
He gave very little response. He sighed, but didn't say anything.
Family liaison officer Steve Lloyd visited Janet Comins' family to update them on this new investigation.
We would meet with the family and we would tell them that a person was being arrested. We would tell them who that person was. And on the day of the arrest, we had constant contact with the family.
Janet's father, Ted, had died in 2014. Steve Lloyd had to break the news of police suspicions to Janet's mum, Eileen.
Eileen's reaction was quite strange, really. Very, very calm, to be honest with you. Because, you know, when you go knocking on bereaved people's doors, you get different reactions. And, you know, so, you know, she was very, very, very calm.
For some members of Janet's family, though, the prospect of another police investigation triggered terrible memories. Janet's uncle Derek had been the one to identify Janet's body.
He says that was the worst thing he's ever had to do, you know, to see her body. And somebody he lived with for years and couldn't sleep. And when we reinvestigated in 2016, all those bad memories came rushing back to him.
Stephen Hough was taken to a North Wales police station for questioning.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Comins in January 1976?
No comment.
Taking into account all those injuries and the cause of death, Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
Okay. Are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment. Several interviews later, we made the disclosure about the forensic evidence that linked him to that killing. And that's when Stephen Hough, probably on the advice of his solicitor, we don't know, but then he didn't talk to us anymore. He answered no comment to every question we put to him around the forensic evidence. Didn't offer an explanation for that. He could have done, but didn't.
Hough continued to say no comment throughout police interviews.
Are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
The man tasked with defending Stephen Hough in court was barrister Patrick Harrington.
It's a safeguard that many solicitors advise their clients about, to say that if you answer questions now, you will be stuck with those answers forevermore.
Is there any explanation that you can give me at this time?
He folded his arms, he was very defensive. His whole body language was just, he just guarded himself up and refused to talk to them at all about it.
Without a confession or any further verbal information from Hough, police had to decide if they had enough evidence to charge him.
At the conclusion of the interviews, we approached the Crown Prosecution Service. We said, this is the evidence we hold. This is the circumstance of the initial conviction. We think that there's sufficient evidence now to charge Stephen Hough.
The trial was set for June 2017 at Mould Crown Court in North Wales. As in the Noel Jones trial in 1976, the charge brought against Stephen Hough was manslaughter. The press and public were told of the new prosecution, but the evidence against Hough that potentially exonerated Noel Jones was kept out of the public realm until the court hearing itself.
The community of Flint were really shocked when Stephen Hough was arrested. He'd been a member of their community for all this time. He went to school with Janet's cousin. Janet's uncle knew his dad and the family. He was still very much ingrained in the community, and for the people of Flint to find out that this predator had lived among them all this time when they thought that Janet's killer had been punished, it just sent massive shockwaves. There was a buzz about the court to find out what this piece of evidence was that was going to prove to people that the man who'd gone to prison hadn't actually killed Janet.
As the prosecution and defence prepared for trial, it became clear that the previous conviction of Noel Jones for Janet Comins' death could cause complications.
The obvious and curious aspect to the preparation of this case was that at the time of the murder, a suspect had not only been arrested, but made what was on the face of it a complete and accurate confession as to what he said he had done. And when he got to court, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Comins.
The prosecution team made the decision to call Noel Jones as a witness.
We knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephen Hough to say, actually, this is what happened to me back then. This is why I signed a false confession. And this is me now. And actually gave really compelling evidence to a jury.
And he was happy to make the case that he hadn't killed her, that the police had put words into his mouth at the time, that he was a traveller who didn't know what was happening to him. So he gave a very strong testimony in court as to the impact it had on his life and how he must have felt as a young, vulnerable teenager having that happen to him without any control over it. You could see the impact that it had had on him. He was talking about how it had ruined his life, how it had tortured him, how although he'd never denied killing Janet up until that point, it had had a massive impact on his life.
Noel Jones' testimony was vital to the case. Alongside the DNA evidence, a new witness appeared with a startling revelation. It was Stephen Hough's first wife, who he'd lived with in Germany.
She'd told the court that she'd remembered him saying to her when they lived in Germany while he served in the army that he'd killed a girl back home. And when she'd questioned it, he kind of clammed up and she said, well, the only person I can think of who was murdered back home was Janet Comins, and she said that he'd put his head down and acted quite cagey about it. But she'd only recently recalled that conversation in light of his arrest and was asked about that during the interview.
The jury was sent out to consider their verdict. The deliberation took 5.5 hours.
Unanimously, they felt that Stephen Hough was guilty of the manslaughter and the rape of Janet Comins, and he was convicted, and he was given 12 years in prison for that crime, which reflects the sentence that Noel Jones had had in 1976.
Once more, Janet Comins' family had to live with a conviction of manslaughter and a 12-year sentence for the man who had killed their child.
They were disappointed in the sentence that he received. But then we tried to explain to the family that the truth is we've had somebody convicted in a very difficult case to prove.
Janet's mother, Eileen, didn't attend the trial.
Janet's mum couldn't cope with that all happening to her, so she didn't attend, but Janet's uncle and cousin did. But it must have been awful for them to have to relive every second of it, listen to the flaws in the original police investigation and all of the graphic sexual detail that happened to her that was just, you wouldn't wish on anybody.
Janet's real killer was identified. Noel Jones was able to clear his name.
There was very little publicity about Noah Jones's acquittal in the Court of Appeal. Sir Brian Levison heard the appeal, apparently with great sensitivity, and the appeal was allowed, as I say, without any resistance from the prosecution. And he is now unconvicted, acquitted of the crime to which he'd pleaded guilty 40 years ago.
We all know that there have been miscarriages of justice in the past. One can't criticise the investigation at the time, although I suppose major errors were made in the identification of a potential suspect. But the police would have had a confession, which is quite strong.
I think it's all about just treating people fairly and, and trying to understand, what they're going through and their needs. Clearly I'll never understand how they would feel, in losing a daughter at 15 years of age. How could I ever understand that? It's impossible, isn't it?
The death of Janet Commins had a lasting effect on the local community.
Stephen Hough is born and bred in Flint. He's lived around here his whole life. He knows the area like the back of his hand.
The Gorseth Stones, where Janet died, became a place where Janet's family and the local community would come to remember her.
That became a focal point for the family to lay flowers and for the community of Flint, really.
People would come and lay flowers here at the Gorseth Stone as a tribute to her. Nobody ever forgot what happened to Janet. This was the biggest case that Flint has ever seen, even to this day. So it's something that people will never ever forget and probably never get over, especially given the fact that the killer was living among them for all this time and just acting as if nothing had happened and came so close to getting away with it.
Stephen Hough has never disclosed the exact circumstances surrounding Janet's death.
They deserve to know what the full circumstances of her death were, because they weren't there, were they? And the only person that was there who knows is Stephen Anthony Hough, who so far hasn't told anybody what the circumstances are.
After sentencing, Stephen Hough was put on trial for the rape of the 15-year-old girl in 2016. He was found guilty and a further 3 years was added to his prison sentence. A case that spanned 4 decades, and finally, in 2017, Stephen Hough was convicted. A bittersweet result for Noel Jones, who lost 6 years of his life and the relationship with his community to a wrongful conviction.